bells of midwinter. It started as a perfect Christmas getaway. My boyfriend Ethan and I had rented a secluded cabin deep in the snowy wilderness of Maine. With no neighbors for miles and a heavy snowfall predicted, it sounded like the idyllic escape from our hectic city lives. The cabin was rustic but charming, with its old stone fireplace and wooden beams, strung with lights. The first 2 days were peaceful. We spent the time drinking cocoa, watching the snow blanket the landscape, and playing board games by the fire. At night, the quiet was so absolute it felt like we were the only 2 people left in the world. That illusion shattered on the 3rd night. We had just finished dinner when it started, a faint ringing like distant bells. At first I thought it was the wind. The sound was melodic but erratic, chiming in no discernible rhythm. Ethan shrugged it off as my imagination, but something about the noise unsettled me. Around midnight, the bells grew louder. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I realized they weren't coming from outside, they were coming from within the cabin. "Do you hear that?" I whispered to Ethan. He sat up, frowning. "Yeah, sounds like it's downstairs." We crept down the narrow staircase, the creaking wood groaning beneath our feet. The cabin was dark except for the dying embers in the fireplace. The sound seemed to emanate from every corner, an eerie chorus of clanging and chiming that set my teeth on edge. "What the hell is that?" Ethan muttered. "I don't know. It sounds like bells, but..." A sudden crash cut me off. The sound came from the kitchen. We rushed in to find one of the cabinet doors swinging open, its contents, a set of antique brass bells scattered across the floor. "Did you put those there?" Ethan asked, his voice tight. I shook my head. "No, I haven't touched those." We picked up the bells and placed them back in the cabinet, double-checking the latch. The cabin had been stocked with random old knickknacks, but these bells hadn't caught my attention before. They were tarnished and mismatched, some with ornate carvings and others plain. We chalked it up to vibrations from the wind and tried to go back to bed. The bells rang again. This time it wasn't distant or faint. It was sharp and immediate, like someone shaking them right outside our bedroom door. Ethan jumped up and grabbed the fireplace poker, his jaw set in determination. He flung the door open, but the hallway was empty. The bells stopped. The next morning we discovered strange marks in the snow outside the cabin. They weren't footprints, more like long, thin drags, as if something with claws had been moving around. The marks circled the cabin, trailing off into the dense woods. Ethan insisted it was just an animal, but I wasn't so sure. That night, we barricaded the door and windows, though neither of us said it out loud. The sense of being watched was suffocating. Every creak of the cabin made my heart race, and the shadows cast by the firelight seemed to move on their own. The bells began again around midnight. They were louder than before, clanging furiously, almost angrily. Then came the knocking, a slow, deliberate thud against the front door. "Don't answer it," I whispered, clutching Ethan's arm. He nodded, his face pale. The knocking continued, growing more insistent. The bells chimed in an erratic frenzy, filling the air with their jarring cacophony. And then we heard the voice. "Let us in," it rasped, guttural and inhuman. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the sound, but the voice came again, louder this time. "Let us in, or we will come for you." The windows rattled as if struck by invisible hands. The fire roared to life, flames leaping unnaturally high and casting grotesque shadows on the walls. "Make it stop," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. Ethan grabbed the poker and approached the front door, his movements jerky and hesitant. "What are you doing?" I hissed. "I can't, it's like, they're in my head," he said through gritted teeth, reaching for the latch. I lunged for him, pulling him back just as the door creaked open on its own. The night beyond was pitch black, the snow reflecting no light. In the doorway stood a figure cloaked in darkness, its outline barely visible against the void. The bells were strapped across its chest, jangling with every subtle movement. Its face was hidden beneath a hood, but 2 pinpricks of light burned where its eyes should have been. Behind it, more figures emerged from the darkness, their bells chiming in unison. Ethan screamed, stumbling back as the figures began to move forward, their feet dragging unnaturally across the threshold. I grabbed a chair and hurled it at the nearest one. It passed through the figure as if it were smoke, and the thing didn't so much as flinch. "Run!" I screamed, dragging Ethan toward the back door. We bolted into the snow, the freezing air cutting through our thin pajamas. The forest loomed ahead, dark and foreboding. but there was nowhere else to go. The bells followed us, their sound growing louder and more frenzied with every step. The figures didn't run. They glided, their movements impossibly fast despite their sluggish appearance. We reached a clearing where a large tree stood, its branches tangled and bare. Ethan collapsed against the trunk, gasping for breath. "They won't stop," he said, his voice trembling. I turned to see the figures standing at the edge of the clearing, their bells silent now. The one in front raised its hand, pointing directly at us. "You should not have come here," it said, its voice echoing like a death knell. The tree behind us began to creak, its branches twisting unnaturally. Before I could react, the roots burst from the ground, wrapping around Ethan's legs and dragging him backward. "No!" I screamed, grabbing for him, but the roots yanked him into the darkness beneath the tree. The last thing I heard was the sound of the bells, chiming in a slow, mocking rhythm. I don't remember how I got back to town. When the search party found me, I was wandering through the woods, frostbitten and delirious. They said I'd been missing for 3 days. The cabin? It burned to the ground that same night. They never found Ethan, but sometimes late at night I hear the bells ringing in the distance, and I know they're coming for me. Christmas horror. We had always dreamed of spending Christmas in a traditional English manner. My wife, Elise, had found a listing for a sprawling estate deep in the Cotswolds, and the pictures were stunning. Ornate wood paneling, a grand stone fireplace, and snow-dusted gardens that stretched for miles. It seemed like the perfect place to escape the chaos of city life. We arrived on December 23rd, the wind biting at our cheeks as we unloaded the car. The manor was even more breathtaking in person, but as I stood on the snow-covered driveway, staring up at the towering stone facade, a strange unease settled over me. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Elise said, taking my hand. I nodded, brushing off the feeling as travel fatigue. The first day passed peacefully enough. We decorated the enormous fir tree in the drawing room and enjoyed mulled wine by the fire. The manor's silence was profound, almost oppressive, broken only by the occasional groan of old wood settling. It wasn't until that night that the silence began to feel sinister. I woke up around 2 a.m., the room icy despite the roaring fire we'd left in the hearth. At first I thought it was the cold that had roused me, but then I heard it, a faint humming, like a choir singing far away. I shook Elise awake. "Do you hear that?" She groaned, pulling the blankets over her head. "It's probably the wind, Adam. Go back to sleep." But it didn't sound like wind. The melody was haunting, the voices layered and ethereal. I got up and peeked out the window. The moonlit garden stretched empty and still. The humming stopped abruptly, leaving a suffocating silence in its wake. I told myself it was just my imagination. The next morning, I didn't mention the incident to Elise. We spent the day exploring the grounds, but the unease lingered. The air felt heavy, the kind of weight you feel before a storm. That night, the humming returned. This time, Elise heard it too. We sat up in bed, straining to pinpoint its source. "It's coming from downstairs," she whispered. We grabbed our robes and crept down the creaking staircase. The manor was pitch dark, the faint glow of the embers in the fireplace casting eerie shadows on the walls. The sound led us to the drawing room. The Christmas tree stood in the corner, its twinkling lights reflecting off the glass ornaments. But the room was wrong. The air was colder, and the shadows seemed to move on their own. And then we saw them, figures, dozens of them, standing in the dark corners of the room. They were translucent, their faces pale and gaunt, eyes hollowed out like pits of darkness. They stood completely still, their mouths open in silent song. Elise clutched my arm, her nails digging into my skin. What are they?" Before I could answer, the humming grew louder, more discordant. The figures began to sway, their mouths moving faster, though no sound came out. I reached for Elise's hand and pulled her back toward the stairs, but as we turned, the figures moved too, blocking our path. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice trembling. They didn't respond. One of them stepped forward, a woman with stringy hair and a tattered gown. She raised a skeletal hand, pointing at the fireplace. Elise and I turned to look. There, among the ashes, was a small wooden box we hadn't seen before. "Adam, don't," Elise warned as I stepped toward it. But something compelled me. The box was intricately carved with strange symbols. I opened it, revealing a handful of crumbling yellowed papers and a lock of hair tied with a red ribbon. The air in the room grew unbearably heavy, and the humming turned into a deafening wail. The figures rushed toward us, their hollow eyes locked on the box. I slammed it shut and hurled it into the fireplace. The flames roared to life, consuming the box and its contents in seconds. The wailing stopped. The figures froze, their forms flickering like static on an old television. One by one, they dissolved into the shadows, leaving us alone in the silent room. We didn't sleep that night. The next morning, we packed our bags and left the manor without a word. I don't know what those figures were or why they were tied to that box. But I do know this. Some things are better left undisturbed. And now, every Christmas, I hear faint humming in the dead of night, no matter where we are. I tell myself it's nothing, but deep down, I know they're still out there, waiting for us to return. The Snowbound Stranger. The plan was to spend Christmas at a secluded cabin in Montana, far from the chaos of city life. My girlfriend Rebecca and I had rented the place for a week. It was a picturesque setting, snow-covered pines, a frozen lake shimmering under a pale winter sun, and the promise of a quiet, romantic holiday. The cabin itself was quaint but sturdy, a single story with a stone fireplace and large windows that offered breathtaking views of the forest. The nearest town was a 45-minute drive away, and the isolation was part of the appeal. The first few days were perfect. We decorated a small tree we'd brought with us, cooked hearty meals, and watched Christmas movies by the fire. The silence of the woods felt peaceful, like the world had been put on pause just for us. But on the fourth night, everything changed. It started with the sound of footsteps outside. I woke up around midnight to a soft crunching noise like boots on snow. Rebecca was still asleep, her breathing slow and steady. At first, I thought it might be a deer or some other animal wandering near the cabin, but the steps were too deliberate, too human. I got up quietly, slipping on my boots and jacket. Grabbing a flashlight, I stepped onto the porch. The cold was biting, and the beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the untouched blanket of snow around the cabin. No footprints. I shook my head, blaming my half-asleep brain, and went back inside. But as I locked the door, I heard it again, a deliberate crunch, this time closer. I turned off the lights and peered through the window. At first, I saw nothing but the shadows of the trees. Then, just at the edge of the forest, I saw a figure. It was tall, wearing what looked like a long, tattered coat, its head covered by a wide-brimmed hat. It stood motionless, facing the cabin. I backed away from the window, my heart pounding. "Rebecca," I whispered, shaking her awake. She groaned, rubbing her eyes. "What is it?" "There's someone outside." She sat up quickly, her face pale. Together, we checked all the doors and windows, making sure everything was locked. When I looked out again, the figure was gone. Neither of us slept that night. The next morning, we found footprints in the snow leading up to the cabin, large, heavy prints that stopped abruptly at the porch. But there were no tracks leading away. Rebecca wanted to leave, but a snowstorm had rolled in overnight, making the roads impassable. We were trapped. That evening, as the wind howled outside, the lights began to flicker. At first, I thought it was just the storm, but then the power went out completely, plunging the cabin into darkness. We lit candles and huddled by the fire, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease. Around midnight, there was a knock at the door. It wasn't a polite knock. It was loud and deliberate, each thud reverberating through the cabin. Rebecca clutched my arm. "Don't answer it," she whispered. The knocking stopped, replaced by the sound of heavy footsteps circling the cabin. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice trembling. There was no response, just the crunching of snow and the occasional tap on a window. Then we heard the voice. It was deep and gravelly, almost inhuman. "Let me in," it called, dragging the words out like a taunt. Rebecca started to cry, and I felt completely powerless. We stayed like that for hours, clutching each other by the fire, until the sound stopped and the first light of dawn crept through the windows. When we finally dared to look outside, the footprints were everywhere, circling the cabin, leading to the windows, the door. But again, there were no tracks leading away. We spent the rest of the day packing and clearing the driveway of snow, determined to leave as soon as the storm let up. That night, we barricaded the door and windows with furniture. The knocking started again, more frantic this time, as if whatever was out there was angry. And then it spoke again, louder, clearer. "Let me in." This time it sounded like my voice. Rebecca turned to me, her face pale. How is it doing that?" "I don't know," I whispered, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. We stayed awake until dawn, the sounds continuing all night. But as soon as the sun rose, they stopped. The storm finally broke that morning, and we wasted no time loading up the car. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the figure standing in the middle of the road, watching us leave. We never spoke about what happened, not to each other, not to anyone. But every Christmas since, I've had the same nightmare of standing in the snow, staring at that figure, and hearing it knock at the door. And in the dream, I always let it in.
Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one.